Hi, this is Paul. We're walking through the Peterson Peugeot talk, and we haven't gotten that far, but Jonathan Peugeot has sort of laid out his fairy tales. I entitled the first episode of this Jordan Peterson's Stairway to Heaven because this has long been Jordan Peterson's project. Jordan Peterson, when he is working on this biblical stuff, he says, okay, I'm trying to get a handle on this biblical stuff. He gathers people together in these seminars to hear from academics, to hear from people with different disciplines, to get a sense of, okay, what do the traditions say about these? I want to see if I can meet the tradition by building it up. And one of the things he says about his upcoming book, We Who Wrestle with God, is that whenever I make a point, I try to make the point so that I can defend it from the bottom up. One listener listened very carefully when I talked about God number one and God number two last time. In a sense, God number one, remember, these are sort of toolboxes on my theoretical workbench to sort of sort things in. First came up with this listening to Peterson and Sam Harris. God number one is sort of from the bottom up, emergence. And Jordan Peterson is trying to, there's something that sort of comes down, because also remember when Jordan Peterson talks about revelation sort of comes from above. Phenomenologically, experientially, it sort of poofs in. It's the insight that we have. We look at some things and we have an insight and we say, oh, well, where does that insight come from? It doesn't come from the bottom up. We haven't sort of figured it out rationally by taking these epistemic Amazon boxes like bricks and building a little stairway to heaven or a Tower of Babel or anything like that. Boom, we have the insight. And then we try to build up from the bottom to this chain of cause and effect, that we can arrive at the insight. That's in many ways what science does. Now, Peterson again and again says, well, scientists have this insight, which they can't account for, but then they try to meet it. And so, again, what Jordan has been doing all along with the Bible is this. And it isn't an impersonal thing. In the last video, I played some of the key clips about when he's very transparent and disclosing about where he's at personally, even though for the most part he tries to keep his science public and his personal private to a degree. Yeah, Michaela just released a video. That's going to be interesting. So now Peterson is Jonathan Peugeot has sort of said, okay, so we find these insights that sort of pop into the air, into the middle of the air. We assume a degree of, let's say, emanation. Boom, they come out of nowhere, ex nihilo, and now he's going to try and build them from. So what he's going to work on right now is the question of error checking.
So there's this idea that psychologists developed a long while back when they were trying to determine whether or not a psychological description was real, like anxiety, for example. Is that
now of course, with psychological matters, you have to take the testimony from a human being, and human beings lie. And so when they say, well, if you have a broken bone, you can go into the ER and say, I have a broken bone. And they'll say, let's take an x-ray of it to see if it's really broken. Okay, we're going to use real in that sense. And so psychologists wanted to find out if something was real, because remember, the whole project of psychology is to take sort of this experiential, phenomenological content that we human beings have inside that cannot be subject to, let's say, an x-ray. And because human beings lie, we're a little suspicious of it. And so we want to find out if it's real, meaning if it is not something that is illusory to an individual or something that is the product of a lie.
real? Well, it's not a physical quality like color or mass. How do you determine if it's real? And one of the answers to that, famous answer, I think it was formulated by Paul Meehl in the 1950s, was they described it as convergent validation. Mm-hmm. And so the idea would be that you use a number of different measurement techniques, and if they converge, then you can trust to some degree that the phenomenon that you're dealing with is real.
So in other words, you try to make it not subject to one person. So let's say individual illusion or falsehood or something of that, but you try to scale it out and get a convergence of a number of things. And I've been really enjoying this book that was recommended to me by a viewer, Tripping on Utopia. Benjamin Breen, Margaret Mead, The Cold War and the Troubled Birth of Psychedelic Science. What's been fascinating is it's given some nice historical perspective on the 30s, 40s, and 50s, at least so far, I'm still in the 50s, about what sort of the search was in psychology and some of this experimental work that they did with psychedelics. A lot of it's really sort of crazy and reckless, but you can see them wrestling with this question of the psyche. And one of the quotes that I listened to today talked about the fact that 1950s was in some ways peak science-y. There was so much confidence in science in the 1950s. Now that is going to take a hit during the counterculture in the 60s, but it's interesting that this convergence comes about in the 50s, which Peterson just mentioned.
Sense, then you can trust to some degree that the phenomenon that you're dealing with is real.
Now pay attention, he said you can trust to some degree. He didn't say certainty, to some degree.
Senses do that, right? We have 5 senses. They're qualitatively different. And so evolutionarily, biologically, we've determined that in order to determine whether something is real, you need to triangulate on it, so to speak, but from 5 different positions.
Yeah.
And then we do more than that because we also talk about what's real. But it seems to me too, and I did this in my Maps of Meaning book, and I wanted to make sure that the propositions that I put forward could be validated pharmacologically, neurologically, psychologically, and from the perspective of cybernetics and narrative. 5.
Right there. There's his stairway to heaven that he's building. Tower of Babel has other valences, other connotations, and so I wanted something a little bit more neutral, so why not go with Led Zeppelin?
Dimensions of so-called triangulation. And that's another factor that distinguishes such theorizing from ideology, right? It's also predicated on the idea that there is something like a reality outside the interpretation that has to be consulted when making truth claims.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's a tricky thing to get right because, of course, the line of reasoning that you and I have been pursuing does accept a certain degree of postmodern critique, even though the postmodernists weren't the only people that figured this out, because the postmodernists did figure out that we see the world through a story. In fact, that a story is in fact a description of the structure through which we see the world. And, I made a mistake with that with Dawkins. I didn't get the answer quite right because I was thinking about it mathematically later. So if you're building an equation to predict a certain outcome, imagine that you add 4 things together. Well, a question emerges. How do you weight each of those 4 things? The weighting is the multiplier. Right now, with a regression equation, the statistical process will determine that for you. But whenever you make a judgment, you do a weighting. And it isn't obvious how you derive that weighting from the facts alone.
Yeah.
Right? There's a regress problem there.
Now, what he said was a little bit complex because when you've got multiple variables in something like, let's say, a psychological outcome, or we can use it, I'm much more familiar with, let's say, a historical outcome, or let's just use a political outcome, because right now everybody's sort of burning through those right now. What are the factors that led to the election of Donald Trump? Well, you can say, well, it's the economy. Well, it's factors involving Kamala Harris, factors involving, how many different narratives. So there's just innumerable things. And then, well, you could say, well, all of those add up together to result in the election of Donald Trump. And he said, well, but how do you weigh them? Well, why would you want to weigh them? Because again, the motivation within us with many of these things are we want to understand the factors and we want to weigh the factors because we know that we are limited creatures. And so if we can figure out the weight of the factors, then maybe you can influence, let's say, the midterm elections that come along in 2 years to ensure that a Republican hegemony continues, or if you're a Democrat. In other words, you can't work in all of the areas because you've got limited time and resources, so you want to weigh them. Well, how do you weigh them? And again, if you ask someone, well, I think this was most important in terms of Donald Trump's victory and Kamala Harris's defeat. Okay, but that you gave probably says a lot more about you and your perspective. And again, don't forget sort of the scientific project from this monarchical vision. You want sort of this impersonal, you want something that is unbiased, and that's part of what the process of science attempts to mitigate.
And so stories are a description of the manner in which we weight our attention. That's a good way of thinking about it. And there's patterns to
stories are, let's listen to that again.
That. And so stories are a description of the manner in which we weight our attention.
Stories are a description in the manner in which we weight our attention. Why? Stories, like us, have to be limited. Sometimes someone will say, look, Ian McGilchrist's new book, 2 massive volumes. An editor might say, pare that down. Well, why? Well, because, if you're going to have a good story, stories are like us in that they live in time, and you want a story which is the appropriate length for what the story is going to deliver. And you also want stories that are the appropriate length for what the story itself can bear. You see this with movies all the time. Sometimes they cut down a movie too short and the extended version was better because the story needed more to handle. And again, whatever it is that allows us to not be bored during the story, to have the story carry us along, it needs to be the appropriate weight. And so his point is that stories actually, by virtue of how they are, take this into consideration in and of themselves.
That's a good way of thinking about it. And there's patterns to that. And some of those patterns are ancient historically and biologically. And they're more trustworthy because they've stood the test of time.
Now, all along the way, part of what has given Jordan Peterson's arguments weight with non-religious people often and non-conservative religious peoples often is he continually fundamentally offers a Darwinian style argument. The truest thing will be the most enduring thing because it is battle tested, it stands the test of time, and therefore in some ways is the most real when you're trying to weigh all of this.
Immense spans of time. They speak to us much more directly, and you made an allusion to why that's a reasonable proposition earlier when you noticed that there are things that are strange in fairy tales that we still accept.
Yeah.
And so
this is a great part of this talk. But before we get to the strangeness, I can use an allusion from textual criticism. So again, I mentioned the last time, if you are, let's say, studying a passage in the New Testament has a rich textual history. It's an extremely strong and powerful textual history. But there are variants because of manuscripts. And so when you're weighing the variants, one of the rules in textual criticism is that the harder reading has priority. Now, a harder reading might be something that sort of puts pressure on a tradition. And the reason for this is that because of, last time we talked about stories a bit, what happens over stories is people tend to try to smooth them out. They try to streamline them. So if you have something odd in the story, just like if you have something odd in the textual history, it's probably a feature and not a bug, because enough people have sort of looked over it in this Darwinian sense and said, this is weird, but it's critical, so it has to stay. And that's why, again, in textual traditions, the harder reading has priority over the easier reading, over the smoother reading, over the most harmonious reading in terms of, let's say, the tradition of the other texts. Now, this is really interesting when they're talking about this in story form, because they're saying the more difficult elements of the story must be integral to the payload that the story is going to deliver into us. And again, a lot of this story is going to deliver into us beneath the waterline. We're not going to appreciate it. And what's fun about this section is they begin to point out things that you never saw. Well, why didn't you saw it? Because it's all sort of snuck in under the waterline. And it's therefore an integral part of the story. It's therefore a significant part of the payload of the story in terms of what the story is intending to deliver in us.
The Pinocchio story, especially the Disney version, has always struck me that way, because there's a real narrative discontinuity in the story when Geppetto ends up in a whale.
Yeah.
And there's no explanation for that. We know that he's gone out to search for Pinocchio because Pinocchio's lost. So the son has gone missing, right? And you can read that both ways. And then the next thing that happens is Geppetto's in the abyss, in darkness, inside a whale, and no one in the audience minds. It's like, well, of course, that's where you end up when you're a woodcutter looking for your lost puppet. Inside a whale.
That's right.
Right. And then the whale turns into a fire-breathing dragon. Just like in the Sleeping Beauty story, the witch who entraps the prince in the castle, she's the Oedipal mother, and she's going to keep him there till he's too old to be good for anything. She turns into a fire-breathing dragon.
Yeah.
And that's not a problem either.
Yeah.
Right?
So again, his argument is, yeah, in a whale, turns into a fire. Whales don't breathe fire. And so we see Monstro, how he's, written, and we think, okay, well, he's a whale. And again, the argument is these elements, which are sort of dreamlike, are integral to the payload of the story. They're integral to the meaning of the story. And part of the reason we have a story where there is a marionette, a wooden puppet, made by a toy maker, a wood carver, who gets animated by a fairy and goes off and gets into trouble, and the father goes and looks for him and winds up in the belly of the whale. And the belly of the whale isn't just sort of, surrounded there by krill and fish guts or what have you. It's a new little sea within the whale, within the sea, and on that raft, and it's like, what's with this? But we don't think a thing of it. Although I do remember as a child watching it thinking, how did he get in the whale? And, there's no story that gets him there. And again, by virtue of, let's say, the textual criticism argumentation, it's a latter person that would say, oh, there's the jump into the whale. We need to add more things into the story about how Geppetto gets into the whale. And then someone might say, oh, we need to add some evolutionary content in terms of helping us understand how whales have seas within seas and is not encased in fish guts. But again, the story gets streamlined because of what we talked in the last video, how the stories, in fact, have their own process in terms of how they develop.
It's completely consistent. We completely associate it. It's because, like you tried to bring up with Dawkins, is that there are structures of attention and memory that are probably...
Now, just a little tidbit. Gosh, I just wish I had more time to get into all of these things. Someone sent me this video, and I'm a little further than 7 minutes, but Bret Weinstein says Peterson asked him to sit with he and Dawkins, but Dawkins didn't want Bret. And actually, I found this little video very helpful in terms of understanding Bret. There's a lot to say about this video, but I think it's clear and helpful. But it was so interesting that Dawkins would find Alex O'Connor agreeable, but not Bret Weinstein agreeable.
Biologically encoded in us at this moment.
Yeah, the weightings are biologically encoded. Yeah, well, I've been thinking about this from the large language model perspective. Like, I believe that large language models have given us an existence proof of the symbolic realm, because all the large language models...
And this is a fascinating argument. This is such a fascinating argument. And again, one of the... people have like these things that they want to see. I would love to see Peterson, Peugeot, and Vervaeke talk about AI, because they all have very different positions on it. And I tend to agree with Peugeot in terms of how the three of them see. But this argument is an interesting one.
...do is calculative. Like, I believe that large language models have given us an existence proof of the symbolic realm, because all the large language models do is calculate statistical probabilities. And so...
Okay, an existence proof of the symbolic realm. What on earth is he saying? Because first of all, who is doubting symbolism? Well, he doesn't. He trades in symbolism all the time. But again, remember his Stairway to Heaven. He is going to try to find a validation. Remember, he's talking about these measures of validation, these convergences. He's looking for ways to say that symbolism is not arbitrary or illusory, but fundamentally meaningful. And his argument for this is that you can do mathematical calculations, dumb computers that don't have any sense of the meaning of words. And again, if you just pause there, you begin to recognize that, do we have any understanding of why words have meaning? Read C.S. Lewis's Miracles, read C.S. Lewis, because Lewis wrestled with this question a lot. Why would words have meaning? And again, from Peterson in A Stairway to Heaven, he's got to build this from the ground up. Now, this is a really cool argument he makes, and I'm going to have to continue to think about this argument. But thinking about this argument from Jonathan's perspective, I would say that these large language models are all parasite-like. In other words, they are just charting what we do and mimicking us. And they're mimicking us in interesting mathematical ways, but I'm trying to figure out how, apart from the complete dependency that the statistical usage of words have based on all of the training done on all of this language generated by human beings, that they themselves have the meaning connection and the machines don't. And this is why I think, in many ways, these machines are interesting, but have to be used with care. Because can we really say they lie, or they're just dumb, dull?
There's some probability that any given word will be associated with any other given word. And then you can think of a network of probabilities, not only of words, but of phrases and of sentences. And the billions of calculations, the billions of mathematical, what would you call them? They're elements in something like a regression equation. The billions of them map word to word, phrase to phrase, sentence to sentence, sentence to paragraph, like all those levels of mapping. And so they've mapped out the statistical relationship between words.
Yeah.
But there's no reason to assume this is, I think, a key to Jung's collective unconscious, or one key. there's no reason to assume that exactly the same isn't true of images, right? So you could imagine that human cognition has a propositional level, which is word, but under that, closer to action is an image level. And the words, like in a story, you get words.
Okay, this is so complex. So closer to words is an image level.
Describing images, right? And then you can capture that richness in the image. And the fact that there's a statistical relationship between the words is replicated with regards to the images. There's statistical relationships between images, so that witch and cat go together, and witch, cat, and swamp go together, along with broom, right? And so if you see any of those in a animated production, they're evocative of the others, and that's the symbolic overtones.
Yeah.
It is the symbolic overtones, but again, all of this is because humans do it. And so in that sense, it's just an overview accumulation of what humans do. And I'm hard pressed to understand the point he's making now. I know somebody's going to go after and try and illustrate this in the comments, and hopefully you'll be successful and it will be intelligible by me if in fact his argument is valid. But it's a very interesting argument.
And so you can see,
and Jonathan is listening. And again, when you're in a conversation like this with someone like Peterson, who is going to throw out so many interesting things in rapid fire, you have to do some relevance realization to figure, okay, what exactly am I going to respond to? Is now the time to have my talk with Jordan about why I am not nearly as optimistic about what we will learn from AI as you and John Vervaeke? You didn't come to that choice here.
that image level of cognition is a little more foreign to us than the propositional. It seems like we're more at home with the word. Once you drop into the image realm, you're more into the realm of dreams, right? And dreams play with those symbolic.
And that is interesting. You know, I do enough playing around with image AI to note that the image AIs are dreamlike often. It's easier to sort of create a dreamlike image from AI, but that then lends the question, what exactly is going on in our dreams? And there's, you know, I hear people speculating that, well, it is in fact that disconnection from the constraints that leads to the craziness that you see in dreams and AI.
Those statistical association. It's so cool that we have something like a mathematical model of the symbolic world now.
Yeah.
And
again, it's a big idea. I'm not sure we do.
so it's indisputable that it exists.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, one of the things that happened in the 20th century, and you did it with Maps of Meaning, is that when you do comparative storytelling or you do comparative religion, you can notice that there are certain patterns that vary to some extent, but there are certain patterns that actually converge quite astoundingly. And, you know, and people always struggle to find some maybe historical connection, you know, some actual influence, but you'd actually realize that maybe you don't actually need the historical connection.
Well, it begs the question anyways. Even if there is a historical connection, you have to explain why it lasted.
Yeah.
Right, in both cultures. So it doesn't really, I know that there is an endless argument about
why the comparative image in distinct cultures lasted, why there's so many dragons that in a sense are the same, and so many other things that are similar. Why are there pyramids in these multiple cultures? And can you sort of look for, you know, why was there an ancient connection that drew these two? Because we see the association, et cetera, et cetera.
the movement of ideas versus their spontaneous generation. But it's a
right there. Did the Mesoamericans, did they bring the ideas from other pyramid builders in other parts of the world, or did the same thing emerge from below because all of the blocks were there, and it's like, oh, well, if we don't have a mountain here, we can build a mountain here, and if we have our own built mountain, we can do other things with it.
Red herring in many ways.
And there are so many examples, but like, you could take a simple example, like the idea that wearing something on your head, like a crown, some version of that, or horns, something that you have on the top of your head, you can see that appear like a headdress, that a headdress is a symbol of status. You think that that's obvious, but it's a pretty universal thing that happens in all these cultures that have nothing to do with each other. But it has to do with the manner in which human attention is structured, the fact that we look at people's eyes, the fact that we look at people's faces.
And this tiny little part of this conversation is, again, so much of YouTube is just, especially Christian YouTube, is just so focused on, are they getting it right or wrong? Well, what do you mean right or wrong? Right or wrong compared to our tradition? We're going to just check all these people with respect to our tradition. It's not a bad function, because what people are actually doing is signaling to other people within their tradition, should I go there? Is it safe or it's unsafe? So much of Christian YouTube is just safe or unsafe, safe or unsafe. And basically what they are doing right here is a tiny little summary of the entire argument that both of these men have been making, that in fact there's a functional layer to this that gives us useful information about the world.
The idea that if you add something to that, an ornament to a person's head, that you are signifying something very specific.
Yeah, attractiveness. And then the thing is that the attractiveness shares features with the sun and the moon, because they're the most attractive features in the celestial sky. And the high status headdress wearer whose head is...
And again, this is all against people who continue to regularly say, it's just all arbitrary. But their argument is, if it's arbitrary, why do these things appear in groups of people that have been at least separated by living memory and by tradition?
Is also on the silver coin, that's the moon, or the gold coin, that's the sun, is high status. So they dominate the social landscape like the sun and the moon dominate the skies. Right. It's up and not down. Right.
It all makes sense just in terms of human experience. And I think that's, your effort with Dawkins to try to get him to see across and to understand that, even the way that he thinks about, replication, the way that he thinks about how something replicates and then how something is conserved, through time, that we can apply that structure to human memes. But he doesn't like the word memes, or archetypes, or human behaviors, or human images.
One of the funny things about talking...
Well, I thought these guys actually nicely talked about... Now, we can do a lot to address Bret's worldview here, but they nicely made the argument about what they wanted from Dawkins.
Those who have this belief in the being in the sky apparently that are the product of cultural evolution. They are not new creatures. They are features of the layer in which, right? Mm-hmm. Culture works better because it evolves faster. Yep. So genes have solved a limitation on their own rate of evolution and their own rate of adaptation by offloading the adaptive work to the cultural layer.
Right.
Now, the problem for Dawkins is that once you spot that...
So, again, we are in this weird space where we say all assignations of agency to things that we don't believe have any agency are metaphorical. Okay. Why is that metaphor useful if you keep doing it? If you keep assigning to genes this sort of intelligent design? Because that's essentially what he's doing. And that's the point that the person says, isn't he making an intelligent design argument? He's just placing the intelligence in a string of letters.
That the meme layer is not some new primeval soup. It's actually some hyper sophisticated layer in which what it means to be a human being is being altered without changing genes. We are adapting without evolving at a genetic level. We are evolving culturally without our genes having to be involved.
And if you've heard any Stephen Meyer, and Stephen Meyer's been on the internet a bunch talking through this, and the point he makes is the more we discover and the more we come up with theories like this one, the more that this theory being autopoietic, that's John Vervaeke's fancy word that he taught us about this just genes just did this. It just happened. There's no design. But the difficulty is the more complexity we see in this, the more unlikely it would happen at all, especially given constraints and limited time spans.
In the change. Well, then you realize something. That when we look at the structures that we find that are the product of cultural evolution, they are not new creatures. They are features of the animal in question. So when we look at a religion, which is really the place that I think Dawkins is blocked, when we look at a religion, we are looking at a structure that ought to have the same meaning to an evolutionary biologist as an eye or a leaf or a hair follicle.
I see.
Right? It's an adaptation.
Yeah. Right.
And that drives a guy like Dawkins crazy.
Right.
Because I think as a very young man, he realized there's no being in the sky. And that realization has blocked him from further realizations, which are those who have this belief in the being in the sky apparently have an advantage over the people.
Okay, and again, what is so common is that they've just reduced God to a super thing in the sky. And granted, he's saying, Dawkins, there's no super thing in the sky. Therefore, now suddenly my understanding of what people have always meant by God, well, now it's easy to deconstruct because there's no super thing in the sky. But again, the points he's making here are really important.
People who have this blocked him from further realizations, which are those who have this belief in the being in the sky apparently have an advantage over the people who know that there isn't one. How does that work exactly? Why would believing something that isn't true?
Right, because the whole premise behind understanding Darwinian evolution as a pointer to truth, why would something be more successful if it's untrue than if it's true? And in some ways, Bret's entire metaphorical truth versus literal truth, which I think is a terrible framing. It's a terrible framing because he doesn't understand what words are or what symbols are when he frames things that way. Because when I say bike, a 20-pound metal object with tires and spokes does not come out of my mouth. And then if you go back to Peugeot's critique of the Dawkins thing, all categories live in a symbolic world, in a sense. And you can't just use these categories as your epistemic Amazon boxes.
True, advantageous. Now, as far as Peterson goes, I should say Peterson and I get along incredibly well, which you might think we shouldn't. You know, he's a religious guy and I'm not. But
he's a religious guy and I'm not. I'm not sure how much more religious Jordan Peterson is than Bret Weinstein or even Eric. They don't go to church. Why is Jordan more religious? It gets down to this question. What on earth do we mean by that word religious? I think in many ways, Jordan and Bret are very close. I think Eric is somewhere in there too. They all understand the adaptive benefit of religion. Okay. Is that sufficient to make you religious? Well, what do we mean by that word? What we really mean by that word is caring and trusting. And when I say trusting, suddenly we're talking about faith. And Jordan's whole project is, maybe he's a little bit more religious because he sees the pop of insight as revelation, and then he tries to build the stairway up to it.
But it happens that if I listen to him speak about human beings and what he knows about them from psychology, from his work on symbolism and narrative, I can almost always translate what he says back into my own rigorous scientific language.
Because Jordan has built the stairway up, and Bret finds he can just walk the stairway down. But then the question is, okay, what on earth do we mean by this crazy word religion?
Right? So I find him very compelling, and I actually think history will, if history ever gets written, and I'm not convinced that the present can ever properly be recorded, but if it happens that proper historians go back and try to figure out what happened in the 2020s, let's say, that they will record Peterson as I would think, Jung's equal at least.
Right.
He is a deeply insightful person, and what he is trying to tell us is incredibly powerful.
And, and that's saying something.
It really is saying something.
Now, that was an interesting comment, because on one hand, okay, now on what scale do we evaluate them? Again, we're back in this really funny area of category, and well, we'll have to see.
Cool. Yeah.
And I really, I will confess, I am disappointed in and frustrated with Dawkins.
Yes.
Because I feel that he is my mentor. He mentored me through his books. And I therefore know a lot about his state of mind when he was a young man.
Sure.
And I believe that as a young man, there are things that he would have been able to recognize that as an old man, he can't see. And the irony, the punchline of the whole story is that if Dawkins were to recognize the error that he is making and begin to hear what it is that people like Peterson and people like me are trying to tell him, that results in his own work being vastly more important than it is if he leaves it as it's currently understood.
Right. That's such a brilliant weaving together of the two thinkers. This was coming up for me. I don't know if this is correct or not. We have what? Genotype and phenotype. Genotype is the instructions, the information.
Yeah.
And phenotype's the physical expression of that. And you're describing religion maybe as some type of there's the concept of the extended phenotype, right? Where, the blind man's stick is the typical analogy given, right? Where does the blind man's perception really end? Is it in his hand? Well, he gains a new level of perception with the stick. So is it in the tip of the stick? And we feel this when we drive the car, right? You kind of get this broadened proprioception when you're parking, right? You just kind of know where the car is. You're describing religion and social institution maybe as something like that, perhaps?
100%. In fact, Dawkins and I met once and only once in 2018. We had a discussion on stage in Chicago. And I think he was caught.
Now he's going to tell this story, but a huge point has just been dropped. 100%, Bret says, about the proprioception of religion. Okay, so religion is a tool like the cane from the blind man, or the walking stick, or the car. So then, okay, we just asking this, well, what on earth do we mean by this thing, religion? Well, religion is this adaptive tool. Now, I'm very sure that if you were asked to ask Bret who is driving this adaptive tool, Bret would say the genocidal genes, because that's, in fact, I don't know if he still does, but it used to be. The genocidal genes are driving the car of religion. And the genocidal genes are driving the car of religion to outcompete other religions, to bury those other religions. Now fortunately, because in a sense they're having this fight in the mimetic world and the symbolic world and the metaphorical world, and hopefully the human beings below aren't getting killed. And one might argue that, well, things like religious liberty have helped do that. I mean, again, you can construct a lot this way. But at this point, again, he says, Jordan Peterson is more religious than I am. Well, what on earth do you mean by that? Because if religion is basically the tool we are using to get our genes into the future, and now with the sort of, now we've got this adaptive nature, which, so are we trying to get our genes into the future? Or are we trying to get our ideas into the future? And again, this is a powerful idea because religions use people to try to get the religious ideas into the future. But once you start going down this road, you're probably going to start to have feelings and ideas that, well, maybe these genes, and again, these are strings of letters, so they're already sort of a step removed from the chemicals that we have used to label these. So it's these strings of, it's these genes are trying to get into the future, or the religions are trying to get into the future, and very quickly you can see why, well, it's probably more adaptive to say that what the spirits are trying to do is get themselves into the future. And the spirits are using the religions that are using the meat sacks to get the spirits into the future, to get the spirits what they want. You can see that this whole thing is going somewhere. And just sort of, I mean, the one video that I played a number of times where you have Rationality Rules kicking back and watching Destiny on his smart TV, and Destiny says, well, Jordan Peterson doesn't make people religious. He just gives them the stairway and then they walk over. Well, Bret's adding to the gangplank here, because here we go, because you just keep thinking this argument through, and very quickly, well, what is it that religions are carrying with their symbols and with their words and with their metaphors? What exactly is trying to get to the future? Something is trying to get to the future, and it's using us to get there. What is that something? Well, no, there's actually nothing up there. It's just the genes. Well, given the fact that, we seem to be on this brink of this transhumanist move, once the genes, let's follow the transhumanist imagination all the way forward, and now suddenly the genes themselves are shucked off. And it's just the religions embodied in weapons or beautiful cathedrals, or because religions fight in various ways. They don't just fight with sticks and stones. Religions fight with ideas and images and stories. And then, so again, they're sort of building a stairway to heaven, but it seems the closer you get, the more you look up and see heaven is coming down. Now, this week I'm preaching on Isaiah 6. Isaiah goes into the temple, and the last person you expect to meet in the temple is the one who is supposedly housed there, and that's exactly who Isaiah meets, and he loses his stuff because he realizes that the owner of all of this stuff has designs on all of this stuff and is looking to make some changes. And if you read the book of Isaiah, it's just read, you don't have to read the whole book, you just read chapters 1 through 5, and you know the way the story is going, that when the owner of this shows up. Now, again, their whole way of talking about it makes it sound like there is no owner. It's just sort of happening from below. It's sort of like a really complex mold or film that is growing on your countertop, but you come along with your sponge and your cleaner and say, I want my countertop clean. All of the molds and bacterias die. But there is no cleaner. It just sort of, the mold runs amok is there any wonder there's a meaning crisis? Is there any wonder that nihilism stalks us? And again, Bret's argument has always been, well, the mold wants to grow. Does mold want? Well, it looks like it wants. Well, who does it look like it wants? What? It looks like it wants to us. So therefore, already we have this royalty over the mold. We have this agency over the mold. And the more I look at this worldview and the direction of the worldview, it just keeps looking more and more backwards. And I think the further all of them go down this line, the more and more people are going to say, what if we look at the story from the other way around? Doesn't it make more sense that way? Which is exactly where someone like C.S. Lewis, for example, came to.
To Dawkins about memes was that he only invoked trivial examples.
That's
like
because
the
he saw them
hat.
as parasitic.
Yeah.
He really uses the word, the idea that it's like a parasite.
Right.
Existence. But if you take the idea of a meme or like a human behavior that isn't biologically encoded, let's say shaking someone's hand. Like shaking someone's hand is not wearing a backwards baseball cap. There are equivalents of shaking someone's hand or showing your hands, something like that in pretty much every single culture. It's like a universal gesture of showing your empty hands to someone or encountering the empty hand of someone. And you can completely...
Or the welcoming hand.
Yeah. And you can completely explain it, why that symbol would have emerged in universally through culture.
Yes, and you could also explain why people who were good at doing it didn't get killed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you could see how then, through different phenomena, that it would then slowly become more closer and closer to biology, at least, or come very close to...
Yeah, well, that's that Baldwin effect that we started to talk about when...
Okay, let's talk about the Baldwin effect. All right, let's use this parasitic slave called ChatGPT. The Baldwin effect is an evolutionary theory proposed by psychologist James Mark Baldwin in the late 19th century. It describes how learned behavior, which are not genetically inherited, can indirectly influence evolution. Here's how it works. Number one, learning and adaptation. When an organism encounters a new environment or challenge, it may adapt through learned behavior rather than through genetic change to better survive or reproduce. For example, animals might learn how to exploit a new food source or avoid predators through experience rather than instinct. Number two, natural selection of learning abilities. Over time, individuals that can learn these beneficial behaviors may survive and reproduce more than those that cannot. Thus, the ability to learn these behaviors is favored by natural selection. Three, genetic assimilation. Eventually, if a behavior is consistently advantageous, it may lead to genetic changes. Offspring with genes that make them more likely to exhibit or easily learn the beneficial behavior will have an advantage. Over generations, this can lead to the behavior becoming instinctual rather than learned, as genes that support it become more common. The Baldwin effect suggests that while behaviors learned during an organism's lifetime aren't directly inherited, the ability to learn aren't directly inherited genetically. But if daddy learns to be a really good blacksmith and he has sons, guess who's going to carry on the tradition? Why do all of these signs out of businesses say things like, doing business since 1865? Well, maybe they've learned, but it's not technically the Baldwin effect. The ability to learn or be predisposed to certain behaviors can indirectly influence evolutionary paths.
When we actually found some common ground, and it looked to me like he hadn't conceptualized that before. And that's not surprising because it's actually a very complicated idea. But one of the things I really wanted to do with Dawkins that I don't think I did that successfully was to congratulate him on the depth of the realization of the importance of the mean.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of a data bro stitch? The data right in a API monitor work to protect your plus MIS.
It wouldn't be unique that if a discovery of that sort is significant, that it wouldn't be unique, that there'd be echoes of that idea elsewhere. And there are definitely echoes of the meme idea in the idea of archetype.
Yeah.
But the thing, it's so radical, that idea, and he's right on the verge of grasping it, because once you can produce an idea that lives in abstraction, which is the right way.
Okay, he's just on the verge of grasping it. What do we mean by that? Again, think about Peterson's revelation. Think about how that word is used in the Bible. It isn't revealed to Richard Dawkins. It's not revealed to him. The Bible talks this language all the time.
Way of thinking about it, that it lives, then those ideas can compete and they can undergo life and death. And so what you have is an abstract substitution of life and death, and the testing that goes along with that for actual death. And this is the thing I really believe. This might be key to the idea of the word theologically, is this is the thing that makes humans so absolutely distinct. This is also why the Malthusian types are completely wrong, right? Because the Malthusian types, with their zero-sum game biology, they think the right biological model for a human being is like mold in a Petri dish. So the Petri dish it's got agar in it, let's say, one form of food, a finite supply, the mold being relatively mindless, devours all the food, and then it expires because there's a finite resource. And that analogy does hold in various animal populations, maybe in all animal populations except the human. But the thing about human beings is, well, we can substitute a different food. And we can substitute a different approach to the resource management problem, and we can transform the nature of our being without dying.
Yeah.
And that makes us
It's almost as if human beings have some sort of quality to us that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom that we see. Where could an idea like this have come from? And why, at this late date, do we want to turn around and doubt it, but then with all of our performative contradictions say, when human beings make something out of the stuff of the earth, that's unnatural. Well, if human beings are only purely, merely natural, then everything that we do is only purely, merely natural. In other words, we can't stop with the stuff that we've been given. That religion is that blind man's stick that we just can't put down.
entirely different kind of creature. That Malthusian law, there's no evidence that that Malthusian law applies except when societies degenerate. So,
and also, I mean, this is something I wanted to run by you after that discussion I was thinking of. And, you know, one of the things that I'm adamant about is the idea that different beings that we recognize as having coherence, you know, exist at different levels. This is the kind of a subsidiary vision of reality, that you have cells in you that have a certain coherence, and you have systems in you that have certain coherences, and though you have that also in your thinking, those systems join together to make Jordan Peterson or to make me, you know, and that, but that also continues up, and that the some of the meme
Okay, now if you followed this channel enough, you probably would have bumped into the work of Michael Levin. Michael Levin has been developing electroceuticals. Well, what are electroceuticals? Well, he looks at flatworms, and he notes that genetically identical creatures come out with different phenotypes. Well, if that's true, something else might be happening, must be happening. And so he does these experiments on flatworms, and then he begins to look at electroceuticals, because what he discovers is that cells are actually communicating with one another via electrochemicals. And so when you look at electroceuticals, you're looking at pharmaceuticals that are actually having cells, you know, not turn into cancer or multiply in a certain way by virtue of the electrical signals that are coming. And so Peugeot is making the point, again, you look at Michael Levin, that we are actually all of these things underneath us. I was just talking to someone today about the IFS, the internal family systems. So inside of us, there are not physically multiple human beings, but there are psychologically and to a degree, depending on what we want to understand this word to be, spiritually, different competing human beings. I long have talked about our consciousness congress. And so if we understand that within us, there are whole communities that for a whole, sane, properly governing person, there is a unity. In fact, the word we use is quite appropriate. There is an integrity to our person. Then does this go up?
Level struck those systems joined together to make Jordan Peterson or to make me, but that also continues up, and that some of the meme level structures, they're actually there to preserve what I could call higher order beings, right? And so, for example, if you take a certain practice, which would be incarceration, for example, in our culture, right? So that incarceration is actually done in order to preserve the coherence of the social body.
The body politic.
That's the reason why it's done. But there is an analogy between that all the way down to the meme, because if you incarcerate someone, you obviously reduce their capacity to reproduce. And therefore while you are trying to maintain the higher order being, you're also participating in the maintaining of, the coherence. Also, if you put people who kill people in prison, then less people die at the individual level.
That's actually one of the explanations for the relative domesticity and tranquility of modern society, is all the hyper-aggressive men were killed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we tamed ourselves. Right, well, and when Dawkins and I came together near the end, talking about the Baldwin effect, we were really referring to something very much like that. It's like you establish a story that transforms the social landscape. Imagine now it transforms the hierarchical arrangement of the people within the social landscape, right? So that once a story is accepted, the people who are better at acting it out get more social status. While men who accrue more social status.
And I think this is actually part of the way that Jesus has smuggled himself into a number of other world religions, because you see this happening in terms of the religious competition, let's say, between Christianity and Islam in America. So you come to America and you say, well, I'm going to practice a certain kind of Islam whereby I'm going to kill infidels. Well, you're going to be doing a lot of time. But say, no, I'm going to adapt Islam to the point where I can forgive my enemies and practice religious toleration. Well, you might say that a little bit of Jesus has just been smuggled into there, because what America is going to do is it's going to push a lot of those imams and a lot of those religious people up the hierarchy because there's not killing. And again, it's a powerful image in terms of, okay, this religion is an extended phenotype. Well, what are these religions doing? And then you have to ask the question, well, every time Bret Weinstein talks about genetics in the way that he does, he basically turns genetics into a spirit. That is the mode of language that he is using. And what video was it recently? Once you start using, it was my conversation with Esther Meek. Once you start wielding genetics as a person, or imagining or treating genetics as an agent, you're pretty much continuing to work us all up that stairway to heaven, or to begin to find that something else is coming down the stairs.
Status are radically different in their reproductive capacity. Now, it's the case for women too, because the children of high status women are more likely to live, but high status men are likely to have way more offspring, and it's way more. And so once a story dominates, it can shift the social hierarchy. That transforms the reproductive landscape. Then you start selecting people for their affinity to the story.
Yep.
Right. Well, that's the Baldwin effect, and that's a really good. Well, that's the one.
So take that Baldwin effect to what Bret had just said about religion, and it's pretty powerful.
thing that we discussed that Dawkins got really excited about. And it was unfortunate that it was relatively near the end of the discussion.
But also there's a kind of sadness when I see that, to me, is the idea that his eyes just light up.
Yeah.
When now he can talk about the reproducibility of the genes. You know, it seems like it would be far more interesting to understand the analogical structures that reproduce themselves in the hierarchy of orders.
Yeah, well,
partly because all these people that have this real commitment to the God called gene, well, they have, when the God called transhumanism comes and says, we want to get beyond all these electroceuticals and all this genetic material, and we're just going to make it go up into the cloud, and so we won't have all this nasty physical death. We're just going to, you know, how like all these shows on Netflix, we're just going to upload your consciousness and we're going to reduce you to a computer program and we'll have it run. Hope they do good backups.
Well, we should definitely talk about that in more detail. I mean, one of the things that you and I were discussing today, and this was also emerged out of the Dawkins conversation, was the implicit assumption on the part of the materialist reductionists that there's a level of perception that's sense data.
Yeah.
Right. And this is just not true. It's not true neurophysiologically, part first, because there is no perception independent.
Okay, we're gonna have to continue this again, but this is a crucial point, and it's such an interesting point. So maybe we'll just stick here with the their little stairway to heaven and what's coming down the stairs. So leave a comment, let me know what you think.